I believe that you and I are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does about any other period of time in history, including the time that Jesus walked the shores of Galilee or climbed the mountains of Judea. I believe you and I are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does about any other period of time in history, including the gospel period. And that challenge requires you to do two things: to find out what the Bible really says, not Chuck Missler or some other speaker, what the Bible really says about the end times. And then the second part is to find out what's really going on, and that's not easy to do either. Now, in our previous sessions, and most of you may be familiar with our briefing package, we've talked about the major themes. Tim highlighted a number of them: Israel, Jerusalem, the temple. All these are themes of end-time prophecy. The rebuilding of the city of Babylon, the situation with Russia, the pending Magog invasion, the rise of China, the kings of the East. All these are subjects of specific prophetic themes in the Scripture. All of these are subjects of briefings that we've put out. The decline of the United States as the dominant superpower on the planet Earth, clearly in the scheme of things. The emergence of a European superstate. The move towards a one-world ecumenical religion. The movement towards a global government. All these are common themes if you've done your homework in the prophetic area. The rise of the occult. Tonight we're going to explore another one that I'm sure most of you will regard as really off the wall. Well, what would you expect from a Chuck Missler study anyway? That's this business of the UFOs. So what we're going to be doing is exploring an area that has been a major topic in the news with increasing frequency in the last several decades. One of the questions we'd like to ask ourselves: are UFOs, are they real, or are these just mass hallucinations? Is this just the domain of the wacko fringe, or something going on? And if it is, where are they from? Have they been around in the past? What does the Bible say about them? Are they friendly or are they hostile? And what is their agenda? So we're going to move pretty quickly. I'm sure you've all seen photographs. Many of these are hoaxes and foolishness, but there are over 3,000 authenticated photographs within the classified community that are regarded as authentic. Now, on June 18th of 1997, just a few weeks ago, on the front pages of USA Today was a computer-synthesized photograph of something that apparently happened over Phoenix, Arizona on March 13th of this year. And these UFO sightings over Phoenix, Arizona, in about 8 o'clock that night, thousands of people saw a craft, what appeared to be a craft, that looked to be several football fields wide, low enough that some of the kids felt they could have hit it with a baseball had they had one. It went about 30 miles an hour, which is very slow for an airborne object, and it created a major uproar. Maps were printed in the paper of all the neighboring areas. The governor of Arizona inquired, trying to find out what on earth was going on. The government had no answers. A lot of anger because they were just stonewalled. One of the mysteries about that, by the way, and perhaps the biggest mystery, isn't just what happened. On March 13th, when it happened, you didn't read about it in the papers except the local ones. And then for some reason, unknown to any of us, for some reason on June 18th, USA Today, and then subsequently CNN, CBS, NBC, all the major networks carried the story with interviews and all the rest of it. What's going on? Are these things real? Now, the problem in this area, if you've done any reading in this area at all, is that there's much that is uncorroborated, just strange stuff. There's also evidence of substantial disinformation by people who have substantial budgets to do that. And you wonder why. But now, if you strip away all that stuff, you find there is too much left to ignore that is substantiated. involving multiple reliable witnesses. You find that many of these craft have been plotted simultaneously on radar. They leave tangible evidences behind. What on earth is going on? If you study the literature, you'll discover that they show up all through history. We find what seems to be evidence of these on Stone Age murals, Egyptian hieroglyphics. You even find them in the journals of Alexander the Great. You find them in the logbooks of Christopher Columbus. So these events seem to be something through history. But most of us, I think, are more concerned about recent events, and you can't talk about this area very much without encountering what is called the Roswell incident. And as you know, we've just returned from participating in the celebration of the 50th anniversary of this incident. Apparently, approximately on the 4th of July, something apparently crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. Now, the Army moved in and initially launched a press release that hit 30 newspapers around the world saying that a UFO crashed. Stories that surround this by the people that were involved are all kinds of stories, but they all seem to involve at least the possibility of 4 occupants, 3 died and 1 was still alive. But what makes the story strange is virtually immediately from an air base 400 miles away, within hours of that first press release, a countermanding press release was issued. The military moved in, sealed off the area, and whatever was there was taken and shipped to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And of course, it was all a weather balloon, a big mistake, and so forth. If you investigate the Roswell incident at all, it becomes very clear that something happened, and that something was very carefully, very skillfully sealed off and covered up. What happened there is a point of great conjecture, but the fact that there's been a gigantic cover-up turns out to be very well documented. And therein lies the mystery and the folklore that's gone on for 5 decades. 2 presidents and a half a dozen congressmen have been unable to penetrate the classification surrounding this and its related incidents. And of course, that's what Roswell is not going to miss the chance to exploit this. They, of course, celebrate this each year, but this past year was the 50th anniversary, and on a town of 50,000 people, we had 50,000 visitors added. And Mike McIntosh joined us with his evangelistic school and hit the streets with the tracts and the rest of it. We had a wonderful time. We did have an all-day conference that was also, as this conference is, simultaneously video streamed throughout the world on the internet. So it was a lot of fun. A few years after Roswell, in fact, July of 1953, there were so many UFOs over Washington, D.C., they had to shut down air traffic. They scrambled interceptors. When the interceptors got there, these strange things disappeared. They were seen on all the air controller radars. Major panic within the FAA environment over Washington, D.C. And this, every time the interceptors went away, they came back. Major flurry. It caused major concern in the strategic councils of the government, if for no other reason than it made communication in Washington, D.C. that evening virtually impossible. All the phone circuits were jammed by panic calls, etc. So let's just keep moving, though, to more recent times. Over Mexico City on January 1st of 1993, there were UFOs seen by thousands of people for hours at a time doing aerobatics over the city. Covered in the news media, not in the U.S., but virtually everywhere else. This went on repeatedly for an extended period of time. These are just snapshots from the local papers. Seoul, Korea, November 23rd, 1996. CNN and Reuters report a huge cigar-shaped UFO that was televised for 10 minutes over Seoul, Korea. But let's go to witnesses that most of us, I think, at least would credit as being reliable. Let's talk about our astronauts. Ed Mitchell, on April of 1996, Dateline NBC indicates that NASA is covering up what really happened at Roswell, New Mexico. That's kind of interesting. Doesn't mean he's right, but here's a guy that most of us, I think, would consider credible. James Lovell, Frank Borman, Gemini 7, on the second day orbit of their 2-week flight. They saw a UFO. Ground control assumed it was the booster, but they corrected it. They had both the booster and the UFO in sight. Walter Schirra, Mercury 8, 1968. He's the first one to use the code word Santa Claus to indicate UFOs being near the space capsule. And this was many years later, 1979, Maurice Chatelain, the chief of NASA Communications, confirmed this use of the code words. Astronaut Gordon Cooper said he saw a UFO on May 15th of 1963. This one was simultaneously being tracked by the radar station down in Australia. He's testified before the United Nations that UFOs are visiting this planet. This doesn't make him correct, but these are not the kinds of guys that you think of as the street wackos or whatever. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Apollo 11, July 21st, both apparently saw lights in or on the crater, and there were unconfirmed reports that there were other spacecraft there. And I won't get it, some of that's been very sensitively classified, I don't want to get into it, but they have indicated, these are all from public reports, by the way, I'm not indulging on any compromised information here. Two large objects were watching them, presumably. Armstrong is quoted in some reports as alluding to a CIA cover-up. Now, you could go through the whole list of NASA astronauts that have made these reports, and this goes on and on. There's over 13 of them. There's other pilots, X-15 pilots and others, Scott Carpenter. One of the most interesting ones is John Blaha. He's the Discovery space shuttle commander. He's been a veteran of 5 of those missions, and he also is a recent participant in the Russian Mir space station. On March 24th of 1989, an amateur radio operator picked up a transmission on an unusual channel used by NASA to Discovery. And I usually play the tape, but the quality is so poor, is not that clear. I didn't play it tonight, but basically it says, Houston, this is Discovery. We still have the alien spacecraft under observation. And so what's going on? Now, something else, speaking of NASA, let's get ourselves in focus here. For many, many years, NASA carefully has avoided any discussion of the Chariot of the Gods kind of thing, the Eric von Daniken kind of viewpoints. On August 6th of 1996, NASA did something that, if you've been following NASA, is very surprising. They had a sudden change of policy. Daniel Golden, the NASA administrator, with great fanfare, announces evidence of life on Mars. The following morning, by the way, on the White House lawn, Bill Clinton, also with great fanfare, talks about this. Now, scientists since that announcement have pretty much guffawed the conclusions they drew from this rock. Part of what's going on here, that rock was, that whole issue was 2 years old. They chose that time, Clinton perhaps for election reasons, NASA for funding reasons, to fan this flame. But we also notice it's increasing. On August 13th, they find evidence, or I should say they announce evidence, of water on Europa, one of the moons. And of course, they've launched 2 missions towards Mars. And this whole issue of life on Mars highlights a problem that the Christian's going to have. Because most Christians are not apologetically trained to deal with the issue. Is there life in outer space? That's a valid question asked by the world. Is there? Well, if there is life out there, you've got an interesting issue to deal with. Is it sinless or is it sinful? Either way, you've got a very, very provocative theological problem, because the scripture says Christ died once and for all. For all. And so it's an interesting issue. And it may startle you to realize that there are over 6,000 professional publications in English and over 2,200 foreign publications. And I'm talking about professional publications that deal with the research and the investigations in this area. And incidentally, it's only in the United States and somewhat in Britain that the government is antagonistic or seals this stuff off. In Belgium and other places where there's major activity, the government is in cooperation with the civilian scientists. In the United States, it's a little strange. There are over 1,350 UFO periodicals. And the early history of UFOs, you'll find over 700 books that deal with it from the 17th century to today, over 300 of the events prior to them. The polls have indicated that over 57% of Americans believe UFOs are real. That doesn't make them real, but it says something is going on, either actually or in terms of its perception. 15% of the population of the United States believe they have seen a vehicle of this kind. But here's the disturbing one we're going to talk a little bit more about later. Over 2%, somewhere between 1 and 3%, the different polls, are the estimates of the population of the United States that holds the belief that they have been abducted by the occupants of these vehicles. That is a lot of people. Something's going on. Is it a mass hallucination or is there something else? A non-trivial problem that we'll be dealing with. Now, part of the problem as you get into this and trying to research it seriously is that you find many of these events in recent decades involve multiple competent witnesses. These aren't lunatic fringe people. These are competent people. They are plotted on radar, in many cases multiple radars simultaneously. They leave tangible evidences on the ground, including radiation. That's hard to dismiss. They are photographed. Sometimes they are seen and not photographable. So they elicit strange behavior. Here's where the problems start. They exceed 6,000 miles an hour without creating sonic booms. That's impossible, according to modern physics. They make right-angle turns at incredible speeds, implying that they're free of mass. But here's the really disturbing thing. They appear to materialize or dematerialize at will, leaving no traces. And that makes no sense. There's no way to rationalize that exactly. What's going on here? Well, one of the things I want to touch on as a little background is this whole business of hyperspaces and the nature of our reality as revealed to us by modern physics and some issues of dealing with message. This is a common theme, of course, and it's going to be an increasingly popular theme in entertainment. Let's talk a little bit about some aspects of this. I want to talk about hyperspaces. These are spaces that have more than 3 dimensions. You and I live and operate in three spatial dimensions. And it turns out to be very, very difficult to even have imagination beyond the spaces that we've had experience with. There are only 2 kinds of people that seem capable of dealing with hyperspaces or space of more than 3 dimensions. That's mathematicians with very special training and small children. And by the way, Lewis Carroll in Alice in the Looking Glass was dealing with wormholes, and he knew he was. But he packaged it in ways that, of course, charm us all. But I'd like to back up and talk about Euclid. Most of us are products of the second most popular book in the history of man. After the Bible was Euclid's Elements. For 2,000 years has provided the conceptual framework that most of us have grown up with. And let me use an example from trigonometry. If you have a triangle in a triangle and add up the angles of each of the corners of the triangle, it adds up to how much? 180 degrees, right. Whether it's a 30-60 or a 45-45-90, whatever, any triangle that we are familiar with adds up to 180 degrees. Well, suppose John Ankerberg and Tim and I went out into a large field out here with a sextant, and we laid out a very large triangle, and we added up the angles in each of the corners, and it added up to more than 180 degrees. What would you conclude? That we screwed up. You'd expect that from a bunch of preachers, wouldn't you? Yeah. No, you check our work and you discover that the angles add up to more than 180 degrees, and if you're perceptive, you'll realize what we've encountered is an additional dimension. See, all these little rules we learned about trigonometry have to do with plane trigonometry. That is trigonometry in a universe of only 2 dimensions. And if you have this experience, if you take a course in navigation and get exposed to spherical trigonometry, you know that you can have 90 degrees. You can have a triangle of 90 degrees in each corner. And this is the kind of insight that caused Dr. Einstein to formulate his famous theories of relativity, the special theory of relativity in 1905, in which length, mass, and velocity were relative to each other, depending on the velocity of the observers, but then also, more importantly, the general theory of relativity in 1915, in which he realized there's no distinction between time and space, that time itself is a physical property, that we live in at least a four-dimensional reality. And this has been confirmed, of course, 12 different ways to 5 decimals. This is no longer really a theory. It's pretty much one of the main pillars of modern physics. It's interesting that he went to his death frustrated because he couldn't reconcile gravity into that. If he'd gone additional dimensions, it would have been resolved. Now, you and I live in 3 spatial dimensions in time as we can deal with it, but one of the great discoveries for the biblical Christian is to realize that time is a physical property. Once you understand that, most theological paradoxes will evaporate. Particle physicists today believe that we live in 10 dimensions, and they'll deal with superstrings and such things in that area. But the questions that will sort of lurk in the back of our minds, is it possible that these entities, these experiences that are increasingly recorded in our society, are somehow involving a dimension beyond our own? Now, the problem with this is that you and I do not have the capability to conceive or think or imagine what it's like in more than 3 dimensions, spatial dimensions, because that's all we have experience with. But we can get some insights in imagining a universe with less than ours and draw some conclusions. For example, if we had a 2-dimensional universe, namely a plane, and there were 2-dimensional people living within that 2-dimensional universe, and we came along and put our finger through that 2-dimensional universe, what would the people in the 2-dimensional universe see? A circle, exactly. They would see their perceptions would be confined to the dimensionalities that they had experience with. Exactly. If we took a sphere, a 3-dimensional sphere, and have it pass through that plane, it would show up as a dot breaking into a circle and going back to a dot, wouldn't it? If we took some odd objects that was tumbling through this, not only would it appear and disappear, but it would change shape as it passed through. Now, let's talk a little bit about 3-dimensional. If I had a 4-dimensional cube, well, let me back up. If I had a 3-dimensional cube, and I was going to try to communicate that 3-dimensional cube to a 2-dimensional world, how do I do it? One way would be to do a projection of that 3-dimensional object in a 2-dimensional plane. And the problem with that, though, is that's very limited, and as we would move it, it would react in very strange ways. We can talk about a hypercube, which is a 4-dimensional cube, but trying to represent that in 3 dimensions turns out to be very, very difficult and has very non-obvious behavior. One way that we might try to communicate a 3-dimensional object to a 2-dimensional group is to unravel it. If we took a cube, we might unfold the cube into a 2-dimensional representation. But you can imagine someone in a 2-dimensional world that would be given this 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional cube would have a tough time assembling it in their mind, comprehending, because they have no experience with it. One of the ways you can take a 4-dimensional cube and try to represent it in 3 dimensions is what's called a Hinton cube, or an unraveled Hinton cube called a tesseract. There's only one case I know of where this was actually used, and that was by Salvador Dali's classic painting of Christ. And it's amazing to me to discover that he was that sophisticated mathematically as to deal with a 4-dimensional cube in his painting. But there are 4 basic forces in the universe. Gravity, of course, which keeps our feet on the ground. Electromagnetic, which is not only the way we communicate, but also it makes our chemistry work. Both a strong and a weak nuclear force, which has to do with the atomic structure. These 4 forces are the only 4 forces that have been observed in our physics. Now, one of the things that happened in 1854 is the most important lecture ever given in mathematics. In June of that year, Georges Riemann made a presentation that revealed a form of mathematics called metric tensors. And the reason this is so important, it took 60 years, but then Einstein relied on that mathematics in order to frame his 4-dimensional space-time for his theory of relativity. Riemann's geometry supersedes Euclid for matters of this kind. In 1953, Kaluza-Klein, using again that same mathematics, but adding one more dimension, was able to reconcile both light as simply a vibration in the fifth dimension and supergravity. And in 1963, Yang-Mills fields were postulated, which integrated three of the four forces. And what people are now, since about 1984, they're optimistic that superstrings, by recognizing 10 dimensions, they can begin to reconcile what we experience in our physical world at the level of modern physics. I'm mentioning this in passing. We talk about the biblical implications of this in our briefing package called Beyond Perception. But the point is, modern physics has moved to the very boundaries of reality, but it includes dimensions beyond the three spatial dimensions that we experience ourselves. And it's possible, it's just a conjecture, but it's possible, that what we're starting to get entangled with are operations from one of these other dimensions. Now let me also try, before we go forward, to shed some of the baggage we bring into these discussions from misconceptions we grew up with. Most of us presume, like all philosophers have since the beginning of recorded history, that time is linear and absolute. We think that an hour today is the same as an hour 10 years ago, whatever. And except for growing, I discovered you don't grow old. You wake up one day and discover you are. So that's a little different kind of a problem. But when we were in school, the teacher went to the blackboard and drew a line. And one point on the line would be the beginning of something, and at the other end of the line would be the end of something, the birth of a person, his death, or the founding of a nation, what have you. Those are timelines. How many of you made timelines in school? Sure, we've all done that. And so, because of that, when we encounter the concept of eternity, we tend to imagine a line that starts at infinity over on the left and goes to infinity on the right. When we think of God, we jump to the perception that he's someone who has lots of time. And that turns out to be bad physics. And it's instructive for us to go a little deeper into this. Time is a physical property. We exist in more than three dimensions. And the fact that time itself is physical is a key issue. Is God subject to gravity? Hardly. Is he subject to the constraints of mass? Hardly. So God is not somebody who has lots of time. He's someone that's outside the domain of time altogether. Time, varies with mass, acceleration, and gravity. Let me give you a couple of quick demonstrations. If I had an atomic clock here on the platform and raised it 1 meter, it would speed up by 1 part in 10 to the 16th. If I raised it 100 meters, it would speed up 1 part in 10 to the 14th, and so forth. Now, in 1971, the U.S. Naval Observatory conducted an experiment. They put atomic clocks on an airplane, one going around the world eastward, and it lost 0.06 microseconds compared to an atomic clock at rest at the observatory. Exactly what Einstein's theory would have predicted from all the various motions and things involved. They put another one on a plane going around the world westward. It gained 0.27 microseconds. Again, exactly what the theory predicted. Now, these aren't much, but they're predictable, measurable, and they occur. Time is a physical dimension. Some of the implications of this, if you read a book on physics, you'll quickly discover they'll usually have an example, a hypothetical example of two astronauts. One sent on they're born at the same instant. One sent on a space mission, the other one stays. And what's typically picked is the trip to Alpha Centauri. The nearest star to us is a star that is about 4.5 light years away. And if you send the one brother, the astronaut, at say half the speed of light, it'll take him 9 years to get there, 9 years to get back, but he discovers when he gets back, he is more than 2 years, in fact 2 years, 9 months younger than his twin brother. This is simply applying the Lorentz transformations in a straightforward way. To give that, if that doesn't bother you, by the way, you weren't listening. Let's go one step further. Let's imagine that we could send them at 99.9% of the speed of light. It would take them 9 years to make the round trip, but during that 9 years, the Earth will have aged 636 years. Neighborhood probably would have changed. It would be a little rough. And of course, one of my favorite quotes of Dr. Einstein, he said, people like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between the past, the present, and the future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. I think that's interesting. And now, one reason I like to touch on this as we get into some of these subjects, there's all this going on for the search for an extraterrestrial message. It's a common theme in science fiction. It's a common theme of many of our movies. We possess a message of extraterrestrial origin, and it's been authenticated in a very unusual way. And what drives our ministry is two critical discoveries. The first is that you and I possess in our hands right now an integrated message system, even though it consists of 66 separate books that were penned by 40 guys, most of which didn't know each other. And this was done over thousands of years. But despite the fact there's 40 different people over thousands of years doing 66 pieces of this message, we now discover it's an integrated design. Every number, every place name, every detail evidences skillful, supernatural engineering. But that's only part A of the two-part discovery. That itself is staggering. And once you discover that for yourself, your understanding of the Bible will totally change. Once you realize it's integrated, that the New Testament is in the Old Testament concealed, that the Old Testament is in the New Testament revealed. It's one book by a single author, a supernatural author. But since God has the technology to create us in the first place, does he have the technology to get a message to us? Of course. The problem is, how does he authenticate it? How does he let us know the message is really from him? Well, several ways, but one of the ways is to give us a message which provably has its origin from outside the domain of time altogether. And that's what Isaiah means when it speaks of God as the high and lofty one that inhabiteth eternity. And that's what God alludes to when he says, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times the things that are not yet done. The fact that God, without error, consistently lays out history before it happens is one of the most important pillars of our confidence that we have in our hands, the Word of God. Now, why am I hammering this so hard? Because I believe you, the people in this audience, are going to be challenged on that subject like you have never been challenged before in the coming weeks, in the coming months, the coming years. Because I believe there's a delusion, a cosmic delusion coming upon the planet Earth and upon the body of Christ in particular that's going to require you to really know why you can so glibly claim that this is the Word of God. You need to know why. You need to do your homework on that. But let's just keep moving here. Let's talk a little bit about the geometry of eternity. If we have you and I experience time as a linear experience. To someone who enjoys more than a single dimensionality of time, say 3 or 4, pick a number, they dwell in eternity, then, see, for you and I, we have a past, a present, and a future as elements of that linear conception of time. But someone who's outside the constraints of that time altogether, the past, the present, and the future could appear to them simultaneously. See, the analogy that's often drawn, it's like watching a parade. If you're sitting on the curb, and for you, the parade coming around the corner is a sequence of events, bands, floats, whatever. To someone who's not in the plane of its existence, but say in a helicopter above the parade, they can see the end from the beginning. And that's sort of a crude analogy of God's posture with respect to the events on the planet Earth. Now, this has some very practical implications, because if you read about this, the whole idea of going back or forward in time raised some interesting paradoxes. But from our point of view, the people in the past, them, are back there. You and I are, say, about here. Okay? Now, someone who's at the throne room of the universe can perceive the problems of them back there, and can perceive the problems that we have today, and praise God, has elected to go back through time, not to change it, but to fulfill it for our benefit. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ did on a cross. You and I are the beneficiaries of a love letter. A love letter written in blood on a wooden cross that was erected in Judea some 2,000 years ago. And now, Jesus, before he went to that cross, gave four of his disciples a confidential briefing. Tim alluded to it earlier, the famous Olivet Discourse. 4 disciples inquired of his return, and he detailed the precedent events to that, and it's so important it's recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew 24 and 25, Mark 13 and following, and Luke 21 and following. And it's interesting that he opens and he closes that briefing with an intense admonition. Take heed that no man deceive you. Tim highlighted the fact that one of the characteristics of the end times is that it'll be an age of deception. And I'm going to suggest the scripture also goes on to highlight some specific deceptions that we're going to explore here in the brief time we have. Now, in this briefing that Jesus gave his disciples, he makes a remark that's subject of a great deal of conjecture and misunderstanding. He said, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." And many good Bible teachers have many reasonable conjectures as to what he meant by that. But I'm going to suggest to you that most of us don't understand what he's alluding to because we haven't done our homework on the days of Noah. And I'm going to share a view with you that is so controversial that it's been difficult for us to find a Christian publisher to publish our manuscript on alien encounters that Mark Eastman and I have put together. We had one of the most prominent Christian publishers enthusiastic about our project until they read our chapter on this. And also another thing happened. Heaven's Gate occurred in Rancho. You realize that UFOs are the leading cause of death in San Diego County. And the president of this company said, "Chuck, what if your book had been on each nightstand of those 39 people who committed suicide?" I said, if our book had been published, there probably wouldn't have been 39 people with nightstands that are in the news. He says, "Gee, you're probably right." But they still backed off. So we're hopefully exploring some secular publishers that may have the guts and the courage to bring to the Christian body the truth about what's going on. Or truth might be overstated. Much of what we're saying is conjectural. But the question is, what does this mean? Now the question is, what were the days? We all know about Noah's flood. How many of you have heard of Noah? See what I'm saying? About 70%. All right. We all know about the flood, and that's an exciting thing. There's plenty of scientific evidence to indicate it was there. I won't get into all that. But most of us haven't known, why did God send the flood? Well, there was a lot of sin. Well, if that's the reason, we better get some life jackets. I'm going to suggest to you something deeper is going on. God did a very drastic thing. He wiped out all flesh, not just men, by the way. A lot of animals died. Strange event. He removed Enoch first, and then those 8 people got the benefit of the ark. Interesting. Genesis 6 is the key, I believe, to getting a handle not just on the ancient time of Noah, but also on what happens in the, I don't think I've held this view for years, but I never realized the importance of the view until recently. Anyway, let's read a little bit in Genesis 6. The first 2 verses, by the way, make a note of this, the first 2 verses are a single sentence. It's divided into two verses in your Bible, but what it says is, "And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose." We'll take this apart in a minute, but I want you to notice, first of all, that the daughters of men are the daughters that were born to men in general, not some special subset. When men began to multiply on the face of the earth, daughters were born unto them. That's a generic statement. Then somebody called here the sons of God, whoever they are, saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and took them wives of all which they chose. What's going on here? Well, the word sons of God in the Hebrew is the B'nai Ha-Elohim. It is a word that is used exclusively in the Old Testament of angels. It is not used for believers. It is not used for leaders. There's lots of conjectures that try to get around this passage. I'll come back to those. But in Job 1:6, 2:1, 38:7, in Luke there's this equivalent passage in Luke 20 verse 36. But also the book of Enoch, which is not part of the Bible, nor is it inspired, don't misunderstand me, but it's a highly venerated book among the Jewish scholars from the 2nd century before Christ to the 2nd century after, and it's a reliable testimony as to vocabulary and grammatical structure. And it also uses the same phrase in the same consistent way. And the Septuagint translators, the Jewish experts in Alexandria that translated the Old Testament into Greek 3 centuries before Christ was born, understood this to mean angels, and so translated it. And the other phrase that we need to focus on, what are these daughters of men? It's Benoth Adam. It is the daughters of Adam. There's some people that try to make this mean something else. I'll come back to. That's why I'm laying the groundwork here. But I want you to know these are the daughters, the same daughters that were earlier in the same sentence, born to men in general. When you get down to verse 4 of Genesis 6, it says there were Nephilim in the earth in those days. And also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. So somehow, the offspring of this union are somehow unique. Now, the word Nephilim is an important word for us to understand. That's the Hebrew word. It means the fallen ones. It comes from a verb meaning nephal, which means to fall or cast down or fall away or desert. The Nephilim. The other word that appears in that verse is the Hagabarim, the mighty ones. We'll come back to all of that. When translated into Greek, the Greek translators use the word gigantes, which is transliterated giants. They did happen to be giants, but that's what the word means. It comes from gigas, which means earthborn. So apparently what Bible says in a straightforward, forthright way, weird though it is and may bother you, is that some angels fell, somehow procreated with women, and gave birth to a strange hybrid group called the Nephilim. Now, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, there's a verse that's often overlooked. It talks about the genealogy of Noah. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Seems straightforward enough. He was a just man. He wasn't sinless. He was justified by faith. So I won't badger that. I think we're all sophisticated enough to understand what that means. But what does this mean? What does it mean? It's perfect in his genealogy. The word perfect in the Hebrew is tamim, which means without blemish, sound, healthful, without spot, unimpaired. It's a word used throughout the Torah for physical blemish, or the absence of physical blemishes on offerings. So here we have Noah singled out because his genealogy was not contaminated. And this is done a few verses from the fact that in general, something weird was going on the planet Earth. And I suggest to you the possibility that it was so weird that it drove God to this extreme measure of erasing the blackboard, picking 8, actually 9, because he pulled Enoch out early, picked 8 people, Noah, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and their 4 wives, and started over. I'm going to suggest the possibility that he was facing a gene pool problem because the Messiah had to be born of that line, and God's plan for redemption for planet Earth required a Messiah born of an uncontaminated line, uncontaminated in the terms we're talking about. That's a conjecture, but let's hold it temporarily and see what else we find out. If this is true, what does the New Testament say about it? Jude, in verse 6 and 7, makes an allusion. He says, "And the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness unto the judgment of that great day." Apparently some angels left where they were supposed to be, and they are being held for judgment. And apparently what they were involved with was very similar to what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. It says, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication, going after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, and so forth. Going after strange flesh and fornication, angels, strange stuff, weird stuff. Peter also makes a strange remark. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 and 5. For if God spared not the angels that sinned, but cast them down to hell. That's what's in your English Bible. The Greek word happens to be Tartarus. It's the only place it appears in the Bible. I'll come back to that. He cast them down to Tartarus and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment, and spared not the old world, but saved Noah. And he goes on. So here Peter makes the same kind of remark that Jude does, but adds a fact. He also ties it to the days of Noah. You following me so far? Now, the word Tartarus that Peter uses is provocative. It's the only place that appears in the Bible. It happens to be a Greek term for the dark abode of woe. It was supposed to be the pit of darkness of the unseen world. As an example, it shows up in Homer's Iliad. It's as far below Hades as the earth is below heaven. Now, we're just talking vocabulary here, but that's what the word was intended to convey. A very special holding place for these people, these angels that screwed up. Did all of Satan's angels screw up? Obviously not. But some did, and those that did are out of the ballgame for a while. Now, these ideas are not new to most of us if you've done any reading in classical mythology. The Greeks had their own traditions of titans. They were partly terrestrial, partly celestial. They rebelled against their father Uranus, and after a prolonged contest, they were defeated by Zeus and condemned, guess to where? To Tartarus. Now, these are just the Greek myths. But what's interesting is this idea is embodied in every ancient culture on the planet Earth. And by the way, the titans of the Greek is Shaitan in the Chaldean, which is Satan in the Hebrew. Kind of interesting. Now, the whole Greek mythology, of course, is just mythology, but the possibility exists that those legends and myths are echoes of the events that the Bible recorded so much earlier. And we have Hercules as an example of a Nephilim, and we have Atlas as an example of a Nephilim. Now, if you go through Sumer, Assyria, Egypt, the Incas, the Mayans, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Persians, and of course the Greeks, India, Bolivia, the South Sea Islands, the American Indians speak of the star fathers that give birth and so forth, seeded the planet. All these ideas are echoed in the cultural traditions of every ancient culture on the planet Earth. The flying god Ashur is an example where they have these things, and also these are interestingly tied to vehicles. The sun god of Ra, and on it goes. And I won't spend a lot of our time getting into the history, but it's interesting that many scholars have sensed the possibility that vehicles are also associated with them. And then the other issues that emerge in the literature are the speculations, who really built the ancient monuments? There are many that believe that the Great Pyramid of Giza was pre-flood. And we today have yet to figure out how they built this with such precision. We could not do it today without laser instrumentation and very unusual equipment. How did they do it back then? The Stonehenge in Britain has similar things. And of course, there's a great speculation about this apparent monument on the planet Mars that's all, strangely enough, associated with the pyramids of Egypt. Who built these things? Is it possible that there were creatures on the planet Earth back in what we might call, certainly call prehistory, that are involved in these things, also in Central America? We find the same kinds of things. Great mysteries as to how they were built. Now, I've gone down the path of what's called the angel view of Genesis 6. I happen to hold that. Many good scholars don't. There is a view that's still taught today by many good Bible teachers, what's called the lines of Seth. They argue that this term, sons of God, B'nai HaElohim, really refers to the leadership of the lines of Seth under Adam, and that the daughters of Adam really means the daughters of Cain. And that what's really going on here that's so despicable is that they were supposed to stay separate and that they intermingled. And that's the sin that's being in focus in Genesis 6. And now why they're called Nephilim is without clear purpose in this view, frankly. Let's challenge this because I think it's important to put some nails in this coffin. The sons of God was never used of believers in the Old Testament. There's no scriptural basis for that. And Seth was not God and Cain was not Adam. Making these transpositions is without linguistic, grammatical, or textual basis. And by the way, there's no mention of the daughters of Elohim, which is a side comment. And there is a grammatical antithesis that is ignored in this view, and I don't want to badger that too much here. This idea of lines being separate doesn't make sense because nations were not even separated until Genesis 11. And the separation of God's faithful was imposed for the first time on Isaac. This is 5 chapters after Genesis 6. By the way, Ishmael was not required to be separate. That's why no one on the planet Earth today can trace their lineage back to Ishmael, but that's a whole other controversy. But Genesis 6:12 should put the nail in this coffin. All flesh was corrupted. The idea that lines of Seth were somehow good guys, then why did they drown? But let's move on. The idea that Seth was somehow, there's an inferred godliness there, is debatable because only Enoch and Noah's 8 were spared. They also, it says they took wives of whom they chose. You don't get the impression that these were good guys. They took what they wanted. That is the Benai Ha-Elohim. And if the lines of Seth were such good guys, why did they perish in the flood? And by the way, as a footnote here, Seth's son Enosh is the one that initiated defiance of God on the planet Earth. There's a mistranslation in Genesis 4:26. Then man began to profane the name of the Lord. Most English Bibles have it in error, but the Targum of Onkelos, the Targum of Jonathan, most of the ancient rabbinical authorities, Jerome, and Maimonides, 12th century, all hammer away at this. It's a well-known problem, text in Genesis 4:26. So the idea of Seth being a good guy is refuted by his first offspring. The daughters of Cain. There's no basis for a subset of Adam in the passage. The Canaanites, by the way, were not necessarily godless. Cain sure screwed up with Abel, but if you look at his genealogy of his children in verse 18 of chapter 4, you'll discover the name of God is in them, which implies that they were not necessarily godless. They may have been more faithful than the Sethites for all we know. But the other problem is the whole view of the line of Seth seems to imply that the daughters of Seth must be awfully unattractive. So there's a further problem. The real problem is the unnatural offspring. What are these Nephilim? They were supernatural offspring, the mighty men of old. Now, there's a problem with this. You see, if believers and unbelievers get together and have children, they may be monsters, but they're not monstrous, okay? There's another interesting thing is the offspring were males. Does that mean the Sethites lacked X chromosomes? Something's going wrong here. Only X chromosomes. There were no women of renown, it seems. And then, of course, this whole issue of Noah's genealogy being so distinctive. And, of course, the New Testament confirmations, which is Jude 6 and 7. We didn't bother with 1 Peter 3 this trip because I'm trying to save some time here. But 2 Peter, even his vocabulary is instructive. So we have the text itself, the inferred separation, the inferred godliness of the Sethites, the inferred Canaanite subset of the Adamites, unnatural offspring. And these are the classic refutations of the line of Seth view, although it's widely held. There's another one that we're going to touch on, and that is the prophetic and post-flood implications of this. The angel view was held, of course, by the traditional rabbis, and the book of Enoch, which I mentioned, the testimony of the 12 patriarchs, which is also just a document that speaks to the grammar and vocabulary. Josephus, of course, has the same view, the Septuagint translators. The angel view was also held by the early church fathers, Philo, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and the whole list. Now, where did it come from? Where did this line of Seth idea emerge? Well, Celsus and Julian the Apostate used the traditional belief of the angel view of Genesis 6 to attack Christianity, and Julius Africanus resorted to the Sethite theory as more comfortable ground, as most churches do today, by the way. Cyril of Alexandria used it to repudiate the Orthodox position, and of course Augustine ends up embracing the Sethite theory, and thus it becomes the official view of the Catholic Church and endures as the official view of most Protestant denominations, not all, but many. It prevailed, of course, to the Middle Ages and so on. Modern scholarship, I've just listed a few: Pember, DeHaan, McIntosh, Delitzsch, Gabelin, Arthur W. Pink, Donald Gray Barnhouse, Henry Morris, Merrill Unger, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, and Hal Lindsey and Chuck Smith for some more recent examples. And I could quote some other friends that are in the aisles of the conference, but I don't want to put words in their mouth. Let me tell you that the majority of conservative scholars support the angel view. But I think most of us that felt that way felt it was just a view of sort of a peripheral passage. I was startled to discover there's more important aspects to it. In Genesis 6:4, it says they were there and also after that. In other words, after the flood. We discover there are tribes specifically laid out in Genesis, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Horim, and the Zamzumim, that are Nephilim. Apparently this kind of thing occurred, not as widespread, but did occur after the flood. We have Arba and Anak and his 7 sons, the Anakim. They were encountered in Canaan. In fact, in Numbers 13, in Deuteronomy 13, when the spies, Moses sends the spies into Canaan, they come back and they say there are Nephilim in the land. We always figure the spies are just impressionable, they didn't have the guts to go in. We dismiss the fact that they really ran into something very strange. And of course, Og, the king of Bashan, is the king of the giants. And Goliath had his 4 brothers. That's why David took his 5 stones, not just one when he crossed the brook. We could study the Bible as a chronicle of Satan's strategies to thwart the plan of God. From the time that he tries to corrupt Adam's line in Genesis 6, all the way through Abram's seed, the famine, the destruction of the male line by the Pharaoh's pursuit of and the populating of Canaan. When God told Abraham that he was going to give him the promised land, Satan had plenty of time to install in the land an obstruction. And that helps explain why Joshua gets these strange instructions that have certain tribes to wipe out every man, woman, and child. People read that and say, it bothers you. And yet it appears that there was a gene pool problem in Canaan as well. And as God focuses on David's line, of course, he allows Satan to focus his attack. And we can go through the whole New Testament and see the different milestones that Satan tries to thwart God's plan. And this is all summarized for you in Revelation chapter 12. But the main point is he's not through, and that's why that leads us to today. Now, one of the problems people have with this whole area has to do with the nature of angels. Angels are strange in the Scripture. They always appear in human form. Sodom and Gomorrah, they actually lead people by the hand. And just to put one footnote on this, remember that the homosexuals in Sodom and Gomorrah went after the angels. You can fill in the blanks. They always seem to show up in pairs, by the way, the resurrection, the ascension, and so forth. Now, angels are capable of direct physical combat. The Passover in Egypt being one example, the slaughter of 185,000 Syrians one evening after dinner by an angel tells you don't mess around with angels. There is perceived a distinction between angels, even fallen ones, and the demons of the New Testament. Many people don't focus on this, and even people who specialize in demonology don't necessarily agree, but there are some interesting problems. But the main thing that concerns many people is that we know that angels don't marry in heaven. And because of that, many people jump to other conclusions. One of the questions people ask me, what do you mean, Chuck? Can angels have sex? See, Jesus makes a remark about the resurrection of the believer, and he says, for in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. That's the passage that causes many people heartburn on this whole subject of the Nephilim. What Jesus is saying is that, see, there isn't any need for procreation in heaven. We're eternal. Procreation was to continue a race that was fallen in sin and subject to death. But the remark he makes has to do with marriage, and it has to do with the behavior of angels in heaven. The passage is silent on the kinds of mischief that angels could undertake if they had a mind to. And we know that a third of them fell with Satan, so they're up to mischief. Now, in the passage in Jude I mentioned to you, there's an interesting Greek word, okaterion. It refers to the body as the dwelling place for the spirit, and it appears only twice in the Scripture. In Jude 6, it's the body that the angels had disrobed from. In 2 Corinthians 5:2, it's alluding to that heavenly body to which the believer longs to be clothed. And it's very interesting to me to recognize that the body that we aspire to in our resurrection bodies is the same Greek word that the angels disrobed from in order to incur this mischief that apparently took place. And 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1 and 2, we know that if, of our earthly house, of this tabernacle resolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is in heaven. And that word happens to be that Greek word that I mentioned. Let's keep moving. There's another problem that is most people don't want to hear about for a lot of good reasons. And that is this notion, these stories that you hear of people who have this belief that they've been abducted by aliens. And there's a continuing deluge of these cases being reported. These stories are too bizarre to accept, but they're too frequent and they're too consistent to ignore. And there's estimates by the pollsters that somewhere between 1% and 3% of the population of the United States may be involved. And what's disturbing in almost each of these, the implanting or the harvesting of human fetuses seems to be the primary topic. And what some people wonder, is it possible that we're beginning to see a repeat of what occurred in Genesis 6? John Mack, head of psychiatry for Harvard. Here's a guy who has 150 peer-review articles to his right. He is head of psychiatry for Harvard, head of the psychiatric thing in Cambridge University Hospital. And he has dealt with virtually 100 of these cases personally. And he has shocked the medical community by indicating that he believes that these things are real, that the beings are real, and that their agenda is to create a hybrid race. The idea that men, women, and children can be taken against their wills from their homes, cars, schoolyards by strange humanoid beings and lifted in a spacecraft, subjected to intrusive and threatening procedures, is so terrifying and so shattering to our notions of what is possible in our universe that the actuality of the phenomenon has largely been rejected out of hand or bizarrely distorted by the media accounts. This is altogether understandable, given the disturbing nature of the UFO abductions and our prevailing notions of reality. The fact remains, however, that for the last 30 years, possibly longer, thousands of individuals who seem to be sincere and of sound mind, who are seeking no personal benefit from their stories, have been providing to those who will listen consistent reports of precisely such things. There was a conference at MIT on abductions in 1992, and John Mack just summarized by saying, if what these abductees are saying is happening to them isn't happening, okay, what is? The consistency and the prevalence of them is a major, major problem in the field, in the psychiatric world. There's conferences on them, and there's obviously lots of controversy. Mack has a challenge: the degree of consistency of these stories, the absence of psychiatric. By the way, they've analyzed the people as a group. They're above average intelligence, had no previous psychiatric history, clearly subject to some kind of traumatic experience, lives changed adversely as a result of all of this. Not something to be desired. And some of them have wounds from these things. And there's even a few cases that have been independently witnessed of these things. There's also the strange involvement of some very small children. So all these things, now this, obviously I hold the view that these are demonic, but they're real in that sense. Demons are different than angels. They seek embodiment. Where'd they come from? Well, I raise a question: what happened to the spirits of the Nephilim? The Nephilim drowned in the flood. What happened to their spirits? They're disembodied. It's my conjecture that they may be the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. That gives Satan a win-win. Satan had a third of the angels to go with him. He knows there's a war coming. He's got a 2-to-1 disadvantage. How can he build up his forces? If he can spawn Nephilim, he's got a win-win. If they live, great. If they don't live, he's got a demon. But the point is, it's a way of building forces. Wild conjecture. I'm just doing this to make sure you don't sleep well tonight. They're not eligible for resurrection because Jesus did not become a Nephilim and die for them. The original warfare, let's shift to prophecy a little bit and then I'll tie this off. The original warfare started when God declared war on Satan. Genesis 3:15, I'll put enmity between thee and the woman, between thy seed and her seed, and he shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. There's a conflict between two seeds. The seed of the woman from that passage, of course, is the title of Jesus Christ, as exemplified by the virgin birth and, of course, the whole chronicle of the messianic line that starts at that verse and carries all the way through to the climax. But most people ignore the fact there's another seed mentioned there, the seed of the serpent. And we see that show up in at least three primary characters at the end: the red dragon, the Satan in the book of Revelation, the coming world leader, Antichrist, whatever you want to call him, and the false prophet. Now, we do know that these forces are very active behind the world today. Jesus says in Luke 21, verse 26, that men's hearts will fail them for fear for looking after those things which are coming upon the earth, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Jesus' briefing, as we highlighted earlier, emphasizes that there is going to be deception, and they will show great signs and wonders. These malevolent forces are going to do miracles. Insomuch, if it were possible, it would deceive the very elect. And there are some of the elect sitting in this audience. If it were possible, you'd be deceived. Now, incidentally, what will prevent you from being deceived is not your intellect, not your scientific background, only your position in Christ. Now, we've talked about the nature of angels, but there's one that I left for last, and that's the fact that angels also appear to be behind the major world powers. One of our best glimpses of that is in Daniel chapter 10. Daniel goes into special prayer for 21 days. And he's visited by a very special messenger that had been interdicted for 21 days by some personage called the Prince of Persia. Not the King of Persia, the empire, but a demonic host of some kind. And he then indicates that a prince of Greece, he says, Daniel, I've come to give you chapter 11 and 12, the climactic part of the book, but when I'm through with you, I've got to go back and fight this guy some more. And when I'm through with him, I got the Prince of Greece is going to follow. The Greek Empire followed the Persian Empire 2 centuries later, incidentally. This is one of those glimpses the Bible gives us of what's going on in the unseen war behind the scenes. But I want to highlight something to you. We've talked before in our previous briefings at these conferences about the various main themes that I highlighted up front. And one of these, of course, is this whole emergence of a superstate on the ashes, on the remnants, if you will, of the Roman Empire. And that comes, of course, from Daniel 2 and 7. We know that the Bible generally talks about world history, prophetically or historically, through the lens of Israel, but there's 2 exceptions, Daniel 2 and 7. And you all know the story of Daniel 2 and the famed image of Nebuchadnezzar, and how the gold, silver, brass, and iron represent the major empires from Daniel to the end. But the 4th empire, the Iron Empire, has 2 phases, iron and then iron mixed with clay. This whole view is corroborated in Daniel chapter 7, where Daniel himself is given a series of visions. Different idioms are used, but the same material. We have Babylon, Persia, Greece, and then Rome in 2 phases. And most of us, I think, have studied this, and most people recognize that of these 4 empires, it's that 4th empire, the Roman Empire, that was never conquered by someone else, broken to pieces, but in the end times those pieces will recoalesce into an empire again, but not with the strength of the former. And what complicates it is something called clay, miry clay. Now, we've watched this with great interest, that we have a European superstate. The Maastricht Treaty obsoletes the Treaty of Rome, provides for a unified superstate with a common foreign policy, a common military, and a common currency, with an economic potential of largely the United States. The good news is their socialistic overhead is higher than ours. The cost of labor is keeping them non-competitive, but that day may change. We are facing a substantial competitor by these policies. But in any case, it's rising to power. The United States has a population base of about 265 million, and Europe has a 435 million base. And it's interesting to see the symbol of the European Parliament. I love this one. It's a postage stamp, but it shows their symbol that they've adopted. It's Europa riding Zeus. Zeus is a beast. Europa is a young maiden, and the whole thing is on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 hills. That's kind of interesting. Revelation 17 students take note. Kind of fascinating. While all this is going on, we have a move towards a one-world religion led by the one who's positioning himself to lead all this, of course, is guess who? The Pope. And biblical Christianity, of course, is increasingly becoming politically incorrect. And it's interesting that if you read Vatican II, Muslims are saved, but Protestants are not. If you're a Muslim, you are considered saved by Vatican II. Read it, check it out. However, there's 100 anathemas if you're a Protestant, condemning you to whatever. And so, interesting profile to stand back and look at here. And the Vatican, of course, is pushing itself. Its agenda is to be the leader of this worldwide ecumenical movement. And if you haven't read Dave Hunt's book, A Woman Rides the Beast, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. So we live in a day of the New World Order, the end of the independent nation state, multiculturalism replacing the national heritage. We're moving towards a centralized socialist government, which, of course, ultimately will be taken over by a dictator. There are potential forcing functions for this, and nuclear proliferation being an obvious one, but I'm going to suggest the possibility of another forcing function that you probably have never heard about. And that may be an organization to face a perceived cosmic threat. That may sound a little wacko. General Douglas MacArthur in 1955 said the next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations must someday make a common front against an attack by people from other planets. When I was doing research in this thing, I never took seriously the MJ-12, the Majestic 12 issue. After doing a little more research, I'm not sure that that isn't more valid than most of us have ever given credence. The idea of a super secret organization formed by Truman that has had a life of its own in this whole area. President Ronald Reagan, before the United Nations, said we need some universal threat to recognize our common bound. How quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. Possibly just a rhetorical device, and yet maybe a hint of something more. Now, getting back to Daniel 2, I'd like us to focus a little bit on a passage in Daniel chapter 2 about the question that emerges from that vision, for those of you that have studied it, is what is the miry clay? It's in the Aramaic, not the Hebrew, which makes the roots different. But miry clay is clay made from dust. The Aramaic root for mire is a root meaning to sweep. Miry clay is made from dust, therefore it's very brittle. But Daniel himself interprets the miry clay, and I'm embarrassed because I've taught this for 30 years. And if you've got my tapes on Daniel 2, you know most of us, Al Lindsay, Chuck Smith, most of us teach that the clay is sort of like democracy. It doesn't cause it to adhere. All of us have read over and over again verse 43 and never paid attention. Only recently did I realize what it said. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 43, Daniel is interpreting this whole vision, and he says, whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, comma, then he switches to a personal pronoun, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men. But they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay. In other words, this seems to suggest, first of all, in order for them to mingle themselves with the seed of men, the they must be something other than the seed of men. You understand the grammatical logic there? It would seem to suggest not only are there strange beings on the planet Earth, but they're not the seed. They're frequent enough to be a political constituency in the rise of this empire. There is a deception coming. Jesus warned us that there be false Christs, false prophets that shall show signs and wonders, insomuch that if possible it would deceive every one of us. There is a restrainer mentioned in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 7. Most of us have read this. The mystery of iniquity doth already work. Only he who now hindereth will hinder until he be taken out of the way. And then shall that wicked one be revealed, whose coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. This is why Tim LaHaye and I think most of us here recognize that the removal of the Holy Spirit and its containers is a prerequisite condition to the Antichrist being revealed. But it's interesting. I personally am beginning to realize or believe that the Holy Spirit is restraining far more than you and I have any idea. And I think the world is going to go really strange right after the rapture. I want you to notice this wicked one. He has 13 titles in the New and 33 titles in the Old Testament, 13 in the New. His coming is after the working of Satan with all power and signs and lying wonders. Don't trust in miracles, because they're going to be performed or counterfeited by Satan's emissary. There's going to be a pseudo-Messiah coming. And 2 Thessalonians, of course, goes on and points out how he will set himself up to be worshipped as God. And we could talk much about that. I encourage you to take a serious study of his origin, his career, and the rest. And I want you to notice where he comes from. Revelation 11 says he comes out of the abuso, out of the bottomless pit. Revelation 17, he'll ascend out of the bottomless pit. There is a big lie coming, because they receive not the love of the truth that they might be saved, and for this cause God shall send them strong delusion that they should believe not a lie, the lie. I think there is a specific, and I don't believe this is just an ism that's already around. I think there's a very specific, gigantic delusion that will be coming upon the planet Earth, and I think we may be seeing it getting positioned already and in the coming months. There is a most absurd war that has ever occurred on planet Earth, in Psalm 2, and by the way, diagram Psalm 2 sometime and figure out who are the three people talking to each other. You'll discover it's a conversation among the Trinity. They say, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast their cords away from us. One of the most bizarre aspects of Bible prophecy that I've never been able to visualize is the world going to war against God. I can see them rejecting God, ignoring God, being ungrateful, or fill in the blanks. But the idea of loading up arms and going to war against God has always bothered me. You see it occur in many passages, both in the Psalms and Revelation elsewhere. Let's take a look at Revelation. As most of you, if you've studied anything about the so-called occupants of these UFOs, you notice they seem to fall in three categories: the grays, the diminutive minions, if you will, and you've that are like people, you couldn't tell them apart, more or less, that are the running things. And then there's these strange creatures occurring more and more in frequent reports called the reptilians. And I just dismiss all this as part of the UFO folklore until I looked at Revelation 16, which I've always took symbolically up till recently. It says, I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, the mouth of the beast, and the mouth of the false prophet, for they are spirits of devils working miracles, which do what? To go forth unto the kings of the earth and the whole world, to gather them to that battle of that great day of God Almighty. Is it possible that there really are going to be aliens intruding in our governmental circles that are going to help organize the government, the armies of this world, against some kind of perceived cosmic threat as a mechanism for this final battle? Strange, strange stuff. But let's get back to the real reality. There's us and them in the past, from the throne room of the universe, perceiving both of our needs. We have an answer, and that is Jesus Christ. And by the way, before I'm running a little too late, so I got to tie this off, but I also encourage anyone here that's not in Christ not to leave this room, and John Ankerberg will tell you exactly what to do. But those of you that are in Christ, realize that greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And if you have a friend or a child or a granddaughter or somebody that believes they've had some kind of encounter, do your homework, plead the blood of Jesus Christ. One quick phone call I have to tell you. I was on the radio with this stuff, and I got a phone call from Universal Studios. A guy by the name of Tracy Torme called me. I didn't ask, I assume he's Mel Torme's son. He says, Chuck, I heard your broadcast on the radio, and you're right. I happen to know a lot about this area because I'm involved in some major projects for Universal in this area. I found out later he was the guy that did the executive producer for Fire in the Sky and some others. But in any case, he says, Chuck, I had to track you down and call you because you're wrong. On your tape, you said that a Christian cannot be abducted. That was the position I took. For lots of reasons, I felt that was correct. I called you, Chuck, because I got to tell you, you're wrong. Christians can be abducted. I didn't have the presence, I was so startled by the phone call, I didn't have the presence of mind to push him as to what he meant by a Christian, but I suspect from the conversation it's more sophisticated. He wasn't just a church person. I think he knew more, he was more sensitive than that. He says, Chuck, you got to investigate the Andreessen affair. And incidentally, after that phone call, I have done that. And the Andreessen affair involves a gal who is clearly a spirit-filled Christian who apparently was abducted. But if you read the record carefully, they invited her and she accepted the invitation. So I'm going to amend my statement, but it's always tentative because we're in an area, from far as I'm concerned, I'm on a learning curve here. I believe that a Christian cannot be unwillingly abducted. And so if you find yourself confronted with some bizarre experience, don't accept any invitations in this regard. Plead the blood of Jesus Christ. Recognize these things are demonic, no matter how they feign or pose themselves. Even Jacques Vallée and J. Allen Hynek point out they are deceitful. They're not from another galaxy. They do not have an agenda that's favorable to our purpose. They may pose that way. Do your homework. But always remember that you and I are the beneficiaries of a love story written in blood on a wooden cross erected in Judea 2,000 years ago. I've trafficked today. I've indulged us to get in some really spooky areas. I'm hoping that it will be consistent with getting you to do your homework in the Bible and to not accept anything that you see on the horizon from the news media. Our news is being very skillfully managed to somebody's agenda. I have no idea what the agenda is. But the only place that you can find out what's really going on is from the Scripture. And your resource is not Genesis 6, it's Ephesians 6. If I could take more time and really hammer home here, I would encourage every Christian in this room to commit themselves to a serious study of the 7 elements of the armor of God that Paul details for you in Ephesians chapter 6. So your notepad should climax with Ephesians 6, not Genesis 6. God bless you.